apologise for the overdramatic start. I've been trying to find ways to avoid starting a session by saying, hello, it's great to be here, and thank you for coming. So I'm just playing around. It's probably more for my own amusement than for yours. But hello, nice to see you. So I've just postponed saying that, really. I haven't managed to avoid saying it. Hello, yes. We've got 3 sessions on this demand-high subject. So if you're turned off by this first session, you might want to make shopping arrangements or something else instead. The first session, what I'm going to do now for the next 55 minutes or so, is basically an introduction to this idea that we call demand high. We're calling it a meme because really there's nothing concrete or fixed or definite. There's no superstructure to it. All we're doing is we're asking some, we hope, interesting, difficult questions about wherever it is that we've got to in our profession and our methodology. And we're throwing these out in the hope that they're interesting to you or whoever we meet to tell about this. And as a result, you're going to take this meme, this idea, and do with it whatever you want to do with it. And presumably it will change and adapt and be different things in different places to different people. So we're sort of sowing a seed. What's going to happen, I'm going to give a sort of introduction now. The session immediately following, Adrian Underhill is going to take this directly into practical areas. So there's not much practical in what I'm doing, but you're going to get a very practical session following on. And then tomorrow morning we're doing an even more workshop-y session where we're actually going to try and relate it directly to your contexts and for you to decide whether there's anything that you can do with this, whether you can take it and use it, adapt it, play with it in whatever way you want to. The Matrix, yes. In The Matrix, I'm sure many of you know the films. Most of us probably have seen the Matrix films. The protagonist, Neo, lives in a world that seems to be very real. It seems to be the real world. But he has nagging doubts, he has questions, and he sort of is constantly wondering if the world he lives in is actually what he thinks it is. And he starts to question it, and he investigates. And it comes to a point where he's offered a choice of 2 pills. He's offered a blue pill, and if he takes the blue pill, then the illusion will continue, and he'll wake up, and everything will just be as normal. Or he can take the red pill. And if he takes the red pill, he will wake from the dream that he's in and discover what reality is really like, the truth behind it. So I guess what we're trying to do is we're trying to offer you a red pill. You may decide you prefer the blue pill, though. So anyway, this talk is a sort of red pill. It is what we do in our methodology, is what we do, what we currently believe to be the truth of our ELT teaching world. Is it the whole truth, or have we missed something somewhere along the way? Is there something we're not looking at? Did somebody put the lights back up? I turned them down to 3 because the screen isn't actually very clear. Is that better? Is that still not much better? Okay. Sorry, that's the red pill. Yeah. We've seen that, you don't need that. Okay. So Adrian, who's in the room, obviously many of you are familiar with Adrian Underhill and his work, inventor of the phonemic chart, author of Sound Foundations, etc., etc. We both happen to live in Hastings, and we both have an IH background. We actually worked for IH Hastings for many years. This is in many ways, IH was our spiritual home and the home of a lot of the ideas that we're now interested in, we're now talking about. We started a research project together. It's not a sort of research project where we went into a library and sat going through books. And it wasn't really an action research project where we went into the classroom and investigated what we did. Our research project involved essentially sitting down together over a cup of tea and talking. That sounds a little bit vague. In fact, it was quite a structured talking. We decided we wanted to do this. We wanted to sit down and formally, I guess, look back over our careers, look back over our lives. We're getting old now, we're getting on a bit. We've been in this business quite a while. That may make us dinosaurs, or it may make us very experienced practitioners. But we thought that there was probably a lot of stuff that had happened over our careers that maybe we hadn't extracted and we hadn't drawn the conclusions to. So we sat down, and for a long time, for many weeks, we would meet up quite regularly and just talk through things, talk through questions that we were interested in, talk through things that we'd seen, and just to see if there was any conclusion that came out of that, if it added up to anything more than just a lifetime of working together. So it was an interesting way of researching things. And something interesting did emerge from this. When we started comparing our world views, we realised that that's tea drinking, yes, okay. I love The Matrix and Adrian drinking tea. Somehow there's a... So what did we realise? We both agreed that, I think, that teaching had moved tremendously through our careers, and that nowadays we're both very lucky. We get to see lots and lots of classes, lots and lots of lessons. We observe lots of teachers. That's just something that happens, whether you're working on a training course or doing inspections or in-service training or whatever. We've seen lots and lots of lessons. And I think we both agreed that we were seeing lots of good teaching nowadays, in the contemporary definition of good teaching. I personally feel that I see more and more lessons that strike me as okay, acceptable, fine. Generally, teachers nowadays are good at finding ways of interesting their students, engaging their students, getting a good atmosphere in the class. There's a sense of fun, engagement, enjoyment. There's lots of work on different skills, different language areas. Things keep moving. There's very little boredom. People are standing up and doing things and running around very often and playing games. So ELT now has quite a sophisticated methodology. We've built up this sort of this thing of current ELT. Could we call it received contemporary methodology? It's like received pronunciation. Is this some kind of received contemporary methodology where we've got sophisticated skills, skill sets for teachers. We do lots of techniques and activities that probably we would all recognise what each other does. These are all things that we're all doing. We're working to some sort of shared standards. The materials we use nowadays are very, very good. They're colourful, interesting, to the point. I would say our materials have probably never been better. Personally, I'm a great fan of course books. I think course books are really good. And if you gave me the option of working a course without any prepared materials from a course book or having a course book, I'd always go for the course book to work with. I don't want somebody to tell me how I have to use that, but I would like to have the course book available for me to use. So the problem that we're talking about isn't to do with course books. It's not to do with the materials and the resources, which are all as good as they've ever been. But if the course books and the stuff is so good, then what's left for the teacher to do? It seems to me that course books are actually so good nowadays that you could, by and large, just sort of hand it to the student and say, OK, get on with it. What is my role as a teacher now? What's left for the teacher to do, apart from operating the materials? And I think when we see lessons, we see an awful lot of just operating the materials. Go on to the next task, go on to the next task, do the next thing. As if somehow simply going through the sequence of stuff will do the job, which it probably does in quite a few cases because the materials are good. So what is a teacher's role nowadays? It's to create that atmosphere, to make the atmosphere enjoyable, a good working, engaging atmosphere. It's to do a lot with nowadays just giving the instructions, directing students on what to look at next, which page to go to, where to sit for the task. So some basic classroom management, moving people around, getting the pairs and the groups and things like that. And then sort of checking answers or closing down things before you go on to the next thing. But is that what teaching has become? To some extent, I sort of feel this is what it's my fault. I've trained people to do this through lots of years of CELTAs and stuff. Haven't we got into a mode where we're telling people this is what teaching is? Stop doing your upfront explanations, stop doing your stuff up the front, and get out of it, stand back, take a sidestep. Your job is to get the learning going in the students, set up the task and then hide. Go away, vanish, let them do the work themselves, let them talk together. That's where the learning happens. So I'm including myself in the problem here, and I think probably many trainers will recognise that there's something that we've been doing over the last 10, 15, 20 years that maybe has started to add up to a wrong total sum. That somehow we've started sending the message out that what used to be called teaching is bad. And that teaching nowadays is defined by a sort of sophisticated kind of classroom management of moving people around, making groups, getting out of it, and then getting back in again just to close things down and move people on to the next task, the next page, or whatever. So, back to Adrian and me chatting. What do we feel we'd taken our eye off? It took us a while to pin down just exactly what was worrying us, but it sort of boiled down to one sentence. A lot of the teaching that we were seeing seemed to be leading to relatively little learning. That's the sort of sum of it. We were seeing a lot of teacher stuff, lots of really good teacher stuff, and we were seeing lots of students who were enjoying whatever it was that was happening, but what was coming out of that? Could we actually say that was the most learning that could have happened in that 45 minutes, that hour and a half? And the answer generally seemed to be no. We had a sense that the learners were not being challenged to their capability, that the teaching level was aiming at a point below the potential learning level, that the learners were not being asked or expected, they were not expected to do more than they were doing. That sentence doesn't make sense. It seemed like somehow our methodology, as we'd added it up over the last 20 years or so, had added up to a great set of techniques and stuff, but had somehow made us a bit out of touch with whatever it was lying behind it, the point of it all, the point of actually making learning happen. Where was the attention to learning going on in the learner as opposed to the teaching going on in the teacher? Have we been over-obsessed with the second one at the expense of the first one? Were our learners as fully challenged as they could be? Were the teachers working below the learning level of the students? I don't know if you agree with that or if you buy into that conclusion. You're welcome to go either way. But if I work for the moment on the assumption that it is true, that something about what we're doing at the moment is under-challenging, maybe we need to ask a little bit why that might be. And as I say, partly I think it's to do with training courses. It's to do with what trainers like myself, what DOSes, what we have expected, what we have told people to do, the messages that we've sent out about what contemporary language teaching is, what it involves. And teachers, very often, if you ask them, do you think you could have asked more of your students that lesson? Do you think you could have challenged them a bit more? Do you think they could have possibly got more out of that, learnt more? The answer will very often be something like, well, yes, probably, I agree, I think perhaps they could, but, and the buts are to do with very often a fear of, or a wariness of upsetting the learner. I don't want to put students in the spotlight. I don't think they'd like that. I don't think they want to be seen to be getting a question wrong or struggling over an answer. And so there's a sort of backing off on the part of many teachers that they don't take the risk of asking the difficult question or the thought-provoking question of students. There's a sort of fear maybe of making interventions, that by and large teachers will not intervene with a question that provokes or makes people think or keeps a question hanging in the air for people to puzzle over for a period of time. That there's a fear of that, and it's a bit neater to simply say, let the course book do the language teaching. Let the course book and you struggle together over the answers to the exercises. We'll check the answers afterwards, and then we'll move on to whatever the next thing is. So a fear of making interventions, a fear of things that you could perhaps classify as upfront teaching. Doesn't mean it's upfront, but it's maybe the things that get close up to the language problems, to the issues, to wherever it is that each individual learner is struggling and fighting to move their own learning forward. Actually having the courage to deal with those on the spot, to work with a learner at their current position and listen to them and give them feedback and help them to make one small step forward in their learning, in their understanding. There's a sort of sense, this is Adrian's phrase, a sense that a lot of current teaching is lobbing stuff over the wall in the hope that, you hit something. I think for me it's a lovely metaphor for teaching. Lobbing stuff over the wall. Hoping something falls into a flower pot, but you don't know because you can't see the other side of the wall. You don't know what is hitting, what isn't hitting. There's a sort of clumsiness about about it. We do all these activities, and we've got a slickness about activities now, a slickness and a professional look to activities. But again, this is another metaphor of Adrian's, but is it brain surgery at the end of a long stick? So we're sort of prodding around in the hope that something we do actually has an impact, actually makes a difference. Have we got some key pieces of our learning jigsaw missing? This is Adrian.
So, I've had the happy experience in recent years of doing a lot of classroom observing, perhaps more than I've done for quite some while. And what I have to say is that in nearly all cases, the teachers are friendly and pleasant, the lesson is well prepared, the materials are certainly interesting and colourful, and the activities are interactive, and the students are happy beyond measure, I would say. They are really pleased to be there. But all this notwithstanding, I've been struck by one constant feature, so it seems to me, that the students are under challenge. They could be doing more than they are doing. The level might be right, but the demand compared with what humans are capable of is low. I can't help feeling that. The teacher is somehow or other satisfied with less, and I believe the students subtly notice this. Everyone means well, but there is a large undemand, and this ultimately catastrophic blind spot means that students are doing less than they could be and get used to doing less than they could be.
I like his phrasing, a large undemand. I think that's a very neat way of putting it. Students subtly doing less than they could. So if that's a brief sort of description of what we saw as a problem, it doesn't seem enough just to describe a problem. We thought that we needed to suggest what an alternative was, or at least the beginning of an alternative, and that's where we came up with this idea that we've called demand-high teaching. So it's the beginning of a proposal for what the alternative might be. There's nothing particularly new in it. All we're talking about are techniques that we all know already, or we're talking about our concepts and ideas that we're probably very familiar with. What we're doing is we're sewing them together into a sort of an argument and saying maybe we need a little bit more of this, and maybe it's a counterpoint to some of the things that you may or may not agree are problematic at the moment. So, as I say, demand high isn't a fixed thing, and it's very much, I mean, part of what we'd like to do this weekend with you is actually get you to nudge it and push it in maybe a slightly different way and take away from you some ideas and some directions that we can go with it, because we'd like to evolve it and we'd like to get more people involved if you find the argument of interest. And it might be particularly of interest to a group of DOSes. I mean, for us, this is a very exciting and important audience to tell this to, because you are the people who have the potential to either say, we don't agree with this, there's nothing to do with this, it's not relevant to us, or some of you might say, actually, this is a hint of something that I could do that would make a difference in the quality of the teaching in my school. That there's a hint here of something maybe that you feel you've seen when you observe your teachers. When you watch a lesson and you think there's something missing and I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe there's something here that you could use to help your teachers, to give them feedback or to give an in-service session or whatever that might help them to move forward. So I'm going to stop talking about the problem and I'm going to suggest what for us was some of the things to think about in terms of moving forward. So, as I say, we've given the name demand-high teaching, and just to summarise and draw a few things together, first of all, it's a set of questions. Initially, it's a set of questions. Are my learners capable of more? Am I under-challenging my students? Would my students learn more if I demanded more of them? And how could I do that? And then also going back to the methodology behind what we do. Have the tasks and techniques that I use in class become rituals and ends in themselves? So do I, for example, come to a group work discussion in a course book, and I say, okay, get into groups, and they get into groups, and then they sort of discuss amiably, partly in English and partly in other languages when I'm not near them, and they do the discussion for 5 or 6 minutes, and at the end I say, okay, great, very good, stop, finish, and they stop, and then I say, okay, right, go on to number 3. And the observer in the back of the room is sitting there thinking, well, okay, but what was the point of that? What came out of that? They did it. They did the thing that the course book said. They got into the group and they had the discussion and they came out of the discussion. But what did it add up to? What learning benefit was there from that? Was there any nudge or push that took them forward in some way? Was there something, some takeaway value from that? Or is it good enough just to say if they do lots of fluency discussions that somehow magically they're going to improve in language level? That's going to have a sort of cumulative magic effect. I'm a little bit suspicious of the magic effect. I think we need to be, going back to the accountability thing, I think we need to know moment by moment what the learning benefit is of what we're doing in class. And there's an awful lot of these ritualistic things that we now seem to do because they are somehow magic pills in themselves. They're good. You do a group discussion, that's a good thing. The observer in the back of the room writes, well done, you did a group discussion. They all got lots of speaking practice. Okay, and? How can I stop covering material and start focusing on the potential for deep learning? This verb, cover, has become the bane of so many teachers' lives, that they are required by syllabuses and schools and heads to cover material, to get through a certain amount, as if the getting through is in itself accountability, if it is in itself proves that the learning has happened. And yet, of course, it's the opposite of proving that learning has happened. All it means is that the teacher has turned certain numbers of pages, but what have the learners got out of that turning of the pages? Maybe they'd have got far more, instead of doing a whole unit of a course book, if they'd spent a day on one exercise and actually dived into it and found out what was inside that exercise. And we're not talking about anything big. We're not talking necessarily about big changes. We're talking about shifts and tweaks to what we do. And very often it's a very, very small tweak to what we currently do that simply brings the learning question into the foreground as opposed to being an assumption in the background. What small shifts or tweaks can I make to what I already do to transform the whole focus of my teaching towards getting learning happening, or getting it to happen more visibly or more tangibly or more usefully or more at the right level for an individual? So there's a set of questions to start off with. We're talking about demand. We're talking about a particular kind of demand. And I think there's been some misunderstanding. Maybe we've misnamed it. If you can think of a better name than demand high teaching, that would be actually really useful. We've called it demand high teaching, but what we're talking about is a very particular kind of demand. We're not talking about undoable demand. Now, when I was at school, my teachers were really into undoable demand. They kept setting tasks that were almost sort of deliberately too difficult for the class and for me specifically. And they would set these as some sort of took a pride as a teacher in giving difficult things for students to do. And people would struggle with them, and the weaker students wouldn't be able to succeed. That usually included me. And that's what we're calling undoable demand. And that's not what we're talking about. And we're not talking about making things more difficult. We're not talking about demanding more. We're talking about demanding different. We're talking about doable demand, a demand that comes precisely at the right level for any individual at any moment. So you as a learner in my class, what is the tiny, small next step that you might make to move forward? And can I challenge you to try and make that, rather than allowing you to stay at your current level? An awful lot of contemporary teaching seems to work at the current level of the students and not move them beyond the current level, to actually swim around at the level. But can I actually intervene in order to push you, nudge you to take whatever the next difficult step is? And that might be a teeny tiny step with, say, pronouncing a single sound, or getting two words with the right ending in a sentence and saying it a little bit more clearly. They may be very small steps, but over time those small steps add up quite dramatically. So we're talking about doable demand for individuals. We're not talking about no demand, a lot of teaching nowadays has no demand. Teachers frightened of putting off students. Students will go and complain if I make things difficult, if I challenge them. So they actually avoid demand completely. So we're not talking about no demand. We're not talking about insufficient demand, demand that actually doesn't ask enough of the students to challenge them. And we're not talking about wrong demand or undoable demand, the demand that comes too much or at the wrong angle. So here's a brief manifesto. Actually, we put this together some months ago now, and I suspect it's time that we actually reworked this a little bit. So, but anyway, this was the original manifesto that we put onto a website. It is, I hope, going to be an evolving manifesto, something that will change, and you maybe have a role to nudge it. And the first part of it is meant to be provocative, although it's quite a simple sentence. It is okay to teach. I don't know if that sounds provocative to you. I intend it as a very provocative sentence. It's okay to teach. I think the argument against teaching has been in holding sway for too many years. And this argument that a teacher's role is essentially a classroom manager who has to step back at every vital learning moment and let the learning somehow magically happen. I think for me that's a period we've been through. We've done that. It doesn't work in its entirety. Bits of it are good, but I think there is a role for the teacher as an active intervener, as somebody who is prepared to help an individual learner to make steps forward, whether by correcting, whether by giving a little bit of information, whether by encouraging somebody to try something or whatever. So not just teach, but be an active teacher who is prepared to intervene. That doesn't mean you stand up front all the time explaining things. It doesn't mean you spend the whole time annoying students by constantly saying things and interrupting them. It means you choose your moment to give the little thing or push the little thing that is the most useful thing to do at a particular time. It just means you have permission not to feel that you have to stand back and hide through the lesson. And doing those things, doing that teaching, is only valid, only purposeful, if you can do it where the learning is going on. Can you start to put your energy not into organising and running materials, which seems to be where so much of contemporary teaching energy goes, into getting the materials doing the things, getting people to move there, move here, get into pairs, go through different pages. Can we start to transfer some of the energy towards focusing on the learning going on, finding out where that is and helping that to happen more? To do that, we need a higher skill set of classroom management techniques. Most teachers nowadays are pretty good at what I'd call the core, the basic classroom management stuff. We've learned not to talk endlessly to no purpose. We've learned to give good instructions. We've learned to get students into pairs and groups, etc., with minimal fuss. We can do all those. Most teachers are pretty good at that. But there is a higher skill set of classroom management, a skill set that involves facilitation skills, as they've been called, but they're sort of misunderstood by and large. Facilitation is often interpreted as letting whatever happens happen, and I don't think it is. Facilitation is a muscular skill that involves finding ways to help everybody to take part in the learning, so the quiet ones don't get crowded out by the loud, fast ones. Can you find a way to get everybody learning in the class at their own speeds, at their own learning point? Can you work at everybody's pace, not just the pace of the fastest few? It seems to me that one of the major problems I see in lessons that I watch is that so many lessons that are working purely at the speed and the learning point of, say, the top 4 or 5 people in a class. It's such a big issue, and it's largely unnoticed by teachers, even sort of up to Delta and post-Delta level. Teachers tend to think that if a few people call out the answer, then that's okay and they can move on. And there's a tremendous reluctance and avoidance of working with everybody in the room. Can we risk working hands-on with language? There's a tremendous amount of devolution of the language work to the course book, assuming that the course book will do the language teaching. We sort of got told off for doing upfront situational presentations and things like that. And as a result, people have backed off hands-on work with language. People feel that it's not their job to stand and work with people to make their language clearer, more accurate, more expressive, or whatever. but I think there are skills to do with language that we need to perhaps rediscover. Things that maybe were used more widely, say if you'd gone and looked at a lesson 20 years ago. And summarising as, expect more, demand high. Expect that your students are capable of doing significantly more. If you just go into class with that as an assumption, that already makes a difference. Don't assume that the weakest student in your class isn't capable of doing something that will actually move them forward in that course of that lesson. It's not a real photo, I'm afraid. I photoshopped that. A teacher's career. It seems to be part of the problem in training, observations in service, inspections, is that everything has been cast around the teacher at the beginning of their career. I'm just going to talk very, very briefly on this, but it's something that's been bugging me recently. So if this sort of pathway here represents a teacher's career, you start out as a teacher, and it's quite a steep staircase for a while. Your initial training courses, your initial weeks, months in the business of being a teacher is really quite steep, quite tough, quite difficult. There's a lot to learn. And a lot of the training materials are geared towards this period, showing you, giving you feedback on instructions, telling you how to do things better, how to organise your class. There's very little focus on the learning because there's so many mechanical bits that have to be dealt with, that have to be addressed. So many just survival in the classroom questions. Which materials you're going to choose, how are you going to operate those materials. And the teacher, as they grow through their career, as they get higher, eventually they reach a point where those basic questions are sort of largely solved and they're to some extent, people get good or they get very good at them, but they're not such an issue anymore after a while. And there's a sort of plateau where a teacher feels, okay, I'm skilled, I'm experienced, I know how to do all these basic things. My argument is that I think most of what we've got in training and in-service stuff, most of the inspection materials tend to focus on these sorts of things. If you look at Equals or other organisations and the Delta, for example, the list of check stuff that you have to go through in order to assess a lesson, a lot of it is around this sort of level. Can you do all these things? But there is a higher skill set for teachers. There's a place beyond the plateau where you have to start climbing again. And I think a lot of teachers are happy to get here and happy to stay there and then don't push forward into asking the next set of difficult questions, which comes after I've got instructions, I've got group making, I can do all those things. Where do I go now to start addressing learning, for example? What do I have to start investigating now to improve my real deep classroom management facilitation skills? Those sorts of things. There is a place to go, and I'm suggesting that it's largely unaddressed. So where would we start to address it? I think maybe there's three zones of potential change that we're suggesting. This is just, again, summarising where we've probably got to by now. So, as I just remind you, demand high isn't a method. We're not selling you a new methodology here. It doesn't matter what method you use. It doesn't matter if you're a grammar translation teacher or a communicative language teacher, if you always use task-based learning. If you're dogme, there I've mentioned the word. I saw somebody was tweeting saying, I hope the word isn't mentioned today. Well, I've mentioned it. But it doesn't matter. You're okay. You're safe with us. We will look after you if you're a dogme teacher. It doesn't matter. Whatever you do, whatever your methodology, is there a tweak that you can make to get more learning out of it? So we're talking about tweaks and adjustments to whatever it is that you do. And in three areas. First, we've mentioned is attitude. Second is to do with your focus of energy as a teacher. And the third is to do with technique level. So in terms of attitude, this is simply the expectation. At the heart of it, the expectation that the learner can do more. And if you go in with that expectation, where does that change things in your lesson? What does that lead you to do differently? How does that lead you to behave differently in your classes? Your focus of energy, moving away from this obsession with the mechanics of technique and material and running tasks, towards what was the purpose behind those. It's more than just the aim of the lesson, but can you find as many learning seeds in a bit of material as possible? And can you explore them live with your students? And can you worry less about the plan and following the steps of a plan and start exploring where the learning is live? Learning is messy, learning is dirty, learning happens spontaneously in the here and the now. And in terms of basic techniques, what are the higher level classroom management techniques? What are the nudging interventions that make a difference? What are the things in classroom management that enable you to make sure that it's not a few people who speak all the time and dominate? How can you sew the tapestry of your lesson to bring everybody in? Don't know if you recognize this guy. That's Caleb Gategno, who is widely known as the originator of the silent way, which is not a widespread methodology nowadays, has to be said, but the influence of Gategno is still quite widespread in what many of us do, and maybe could be more so. I just want to mention one thing from Gategno. He didn't call his methodology the silent way. He referred to it as the subordination of teaching to learning. And I like that phrase. I think that's a really useful phrase to carry around in the head. Is it possible that recently we've been a little bit over-obsessed with the subordination of learning to teaching, that we've got a bit in love with our techniques and our methodology and our materials, and we've lost track of the fact that the point is to get the learning going? Maybe if we can find a way to subordinate the teaching again to the learning, if we can up the learning and use the materials and resources we have in that service. I don't know if this is going to play. Move. Oh, okay. This is my 1-year-old. It's fascinating to watch him. He's learning as he's living. Constantly exploring life. He's living right at the edge, his frontier. Everything he does is pushing to discover something new. This is about 5 days after he first discovered he could stand up and balance and move. So he's just beginning to move around. But he's already searching for something else to do, something else to learn, something else to discover. He's trying out sounds that aren't quite words yet, but sometimes sound like daddy. He's pressing buttons. He's trying to balance. There's a degree of engagement there. Nobody's telling him, you have to learn this next, you have to do this next. He's constantly engaged at the frontier of his learning, constantly pushing himself forward. It's quite extraordinary to watch, actually, as a teacher and a trainer and a writer of educational stuff, to see somebody who's got nobody telling them, this is what you've got to do next, this is your homework. He's just challenging himself the whole time. Now, if we're teaching adults or teenagers or whatever, then there's a much more difficult problem of engagement there, that there's so many other distractions, it's really hard to pull somebody back into that zone of engagement. But what if we could do that? What if we could actually get them more fully engaged in the moment of learning? What if we could encourage people to start seeing the next challenge for themselves, and with that kind of dedication, constantly pushing themselves to try and move forward a step? Somehow my classrooms that I teach in don't often feel like that. They feel like, me throwing out, okay, now do this. But the moments that I can get a class feeling like that, where they're on the edge of the next learning step, and you can see it in people's eyes and you can feel the atmosphere in the room. If I could make that happen more, I'd be very happy as a trainer. I'm just going to very briefly run through a little list of demand high tweaks, really, or differences or adjustments. I've rather cheekily labelled the first column "received contemporary." This is an unfair term probably, but it amuses us, I think, to call what we do, what you and I and probably lots of us do, the sort of standard normal methodology that we're familiar with. And we're going to compare that with demand high, what the difference might be in demand high. So if received contemporary tends to be quite materials-centred, is it possible to be more learning-centred? We've discussed that. If our methodology is becoming a little bit ritualised, get into pairs, get into groups, is it possible to break out of that a little bit and find out and explore where the learning is going on a bit more, if we can break away from the rituals? The teacher tends to be a hub in a lot of what happens in class. The teacher asks a question, student answers. The teacher asks another question, student answers. The teacher repeats it. There's a lot that goes, if you draw the lines of communication, there's an awful lot of to and fro. Is it possible to find a way to get everybody interacting in the lesson? To get the thread of conversation backwards and forwards across the room, where the teacher plays an active intervening role, but is not the person who necessarily answers or tops and tails everything? I've discussed a sort of abdicated facilitation, this misdefinition of facilitation as letting whatever happens, happens, and that's okay, that's your role. Can we get away from that towards this management that is prepared to intervene actively at any moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher's voice is particularly loud or even heard a lot during the lesson? It's a choice of moment of intervention that will make impact, that will make the most difference. Again, it's Adrian's phrase, but can you find the least that is enough that actually makes a good difference to the lesson? What is the least you can do that is enough to make a big difference? There tends to be very little language upgrade in many contemporary classrooms. There's the occasional correction of a mistake, but it's quite often token and quite often doesn't actually lead very far. The student corrects the mistake and we move on, as opposed to swimming around in the mistake and exploring the mistake and enjoying the mistake and moving forward outwards from the mistake. Can we actually work on language upgrade as a core thing that it should be part of our jobs? It's something we should be doing as language teachers. Actually working on constant upgrade, constantly saying, okay, that's okay, but it's not, you could do better than that. If you think about the ending on the third word. Okay, now try the sentence again. Okay, so that student has now made a small step upwards, a small language upgrade. Done 20 times, 30 times with different people in a lesson, you've got a whole class that has listened to each other, learnt from each other, and moved forward, moved upwards. I see remarkably little language upgrade in the majority of lessons that I observe. Hardly any. As I say, this is something that teachers by and large nowadays seem to devolve to the course book, assuming the language upgrade can be safely left to the experts who wrote the books. Fun is added on. Lots of teachers, particularly the lower edge of that step ladder, they tend to feel you've always got to add the fun into the lesson. There has to be a game element, there has to be some running around. How can I make this enjoyable? How can my students be interested in this? Would it be possible to start finding the engagement more back with the core subject matter? If we actually engaged with the language and the language problems, is there perhaps enough that's interesting in that to carry us through the lesson? If you engage deeply with something, it becomes exciting and challenging in its own right. And maybe we've been obsessed and worried for too long about how we can add a game element onto things, when in fact the game is in the language problem. It's in the upgrade. It's in the challenging myself. And maybe we can start to worry a little bit more about getting back to that. Quite often the game that's added on pulls away from the language. I watched a lesson only a month or two ago where a person did a sort of running around game, quiz, adventure thing on phrasal verbs. And it lasted about 25 minutes in the lesson. And at the end, the only feedback done was on who won the game and why this team had more points than that team. There was no addressing of the phrasal verb issues, which had only sort of been tokenly done in order to get the points in the game. And it leaves you wondering, what's happened to our profession that we can't actually work on the language, but we have to make it into this sort of spurious fun. That it, okay, is fun, and students love running around, but can we not find a way to get the fun that is in the phrasal verbs? I don't know if you think phrasal verbs are fun, but they can be dealt with in a way that that challenges the learners and is interesting in its own right. I've mentioned the devolving of language work. Can we get back to hands-on language work where we're not frightened as teachers to say, okay, let's look at that problem. Okay, I'll write it up on the board, or you say it again. Okay, now you say it. You say it differently from him. What's the difference between the two ways you say it? Okay, can you notice the difference? What about you? Do you say it in the same way? Can we start to put language into the live, open laboratory of the classroom and deal with it? Praise is an interesting one. There's an awful lot of praise in contemporary classrooms. It's almost forbidden not to praise everything a learner says. Whatever they say, good, you have to say good or excellent or fantastic, or you get a sort of praise inflation where after a while you've said, that's absolutely fantastic, and then the next person says something even better and you don't know where to go. And nobody improves because they're all fantastic. We need to get away from this, this purposeless, all-purpose praise to giving accurate feedback. We need to learn again how, when a student says something, to say something back to them that helps them reflect on, understand the quality of what they said, to actually be able to address something maybe that they could take as a small step to improve what they said. I'm not saying, no praise at all. Maybe praise has a value. If you give feedback to a learner and they try a sentence again, and you give them feedback again and they try it again, and then third or fourth time, they actually are saying something that is substantially better than the first time they said it, then maybe that's a time to say, good. Or whatever you want to say. But it actually means something then. If you reserve your good and say it only occasionally when something is good, it actually has a value and it has an echo and it has a resonance in the room. So can we learn to give more feedback, maybe, less praise? Can we ask questions that instead of testing whether a student has got the right or the wrong answer, actually start to uncover the processes of the thinking, actually uncover what's behind the question? These are things that I think we're going to look at more as practical techniques as we go on through the time we're looking at this. Does getting a correct answer close down a question? Is that the end of it? I ask a student, okay, what's the answer to number 5? The student says the answer, I say yes or good or fantastic, and that extinguishes it, that kills it. There's nowhere else to go after you've said good. Can we find a way to keep it alive a little bit, even for 20 seconds or 2 minutes or 20 minutes? Maybe there's something more than just one person giving the right answer. Maybe there's something else in the question that's worth spending time on. Can we stay with answers, work on improving them, work on playing with them, work on exploring them? Which means, of course, we probably don't necessarily accept and validate the first answer, but we push and nudge students moment by moment. Just 3 more of these. The sphere of putting students in the spotlight is very much a part of a lot of the contemporary teachers' sort of worldview. The fear that putting students in a position where they have to be seen or heard to be answering questions is potentially embarrassing. And yet this concept of working one-to-one in the class, working, as I was just sort of pseudo-demonstrating there, helping somebody to upgrade, say a sentence, okay, I'm going to give you some feedback on it. Okay, do this, and the student tries a second time. Okay, listen to me saying it. Now you try it again. Okay, what about the third word? Okay, listen to my intonation. Maybe 4 or 5 times, working close up with that student. Maybe bringing in somebody else from across the room. Helping students to upgrade live, one-to-one, little mini lesson for that student. If you do that 5 or 6 times in the lesson with different individuals around the class and then different people the next lesson, slowly over time, there is a massive impact, a massive result of everybody upgrading. And that's something that tends not to happen very much nowadays. There's a sort of working together with the whole group, which often involves, okay, everybody repeat the sentence, okay, that's good, and then you move on. That doesn't help anybody. There's no upgrade involved in repeating something once without feedback. Feedback, upgrade, step by step, moving forward. And I mentioned expectation, expecting that students will actually do much better than you currently ask of them, or even maybe they believe they can do. That's great when a student goes out of a lesson. I didn't know I could do that. I didn't think I'd be able to do that. Even if what we're talking about is one sound, or saying one sentence well, or getting one answer different from the original answer that they wrote. That is an achievement in a lesson. That is an accountable step forward. There's a sort of view that correctness is important, the right answer is important in communicative methodology, but there's much more than right answers to answers. It's the exploration around answers and the upgrading of what you can currently do that is interesting. So maybe we can contrast this sort of notion of we should be mainly communicating and getting a correct final answer with a more sort of playful, constant playing around, engaging with the language, and everybody at their own level upgrading, taking the next step forward. Maybe a very simple, practical way of doing this is this little, I don't know what to call it, little description of what might happen in class. This is one practical way to get demand high, a sort of aspect of demand high teaching going. There is presumably learning happening in a lesson, in your lesson or in a teacher's lesson. The teacher observes that, notices it, sees the learning that's happening, and on the basis of what they see, they select a small nudge. They select a small push, something that is just right for the learner at that moment, in that context, in that room with the other people, to do with what we're focusing on, something that, not for the whole class, but for one individual, would push them forward. And the teacher selects that nudge, and the font isn't right there, but it says nudge. The teacher gives that nudge that pushes that individual forward, and then watches what learning comes out of that in order to then go around the circle again and decide, maybe for the same person or maybe for another person, what is the next nudge forward? It's a very simple little motor, but that motor is a motor that actually gets real upgrade and real learning happening in a lesson. I think I just need to draw it to a conclusion for the moment, and as you know, we'll be passing on the talk as we go on. So just to remind you that behind most of this, there is this one basic question. Am I engaging the full human learning potential of the students in my class? This is going to be picked up by Adrian in the next talk, where we'll look at practical ideas. I'd just like to mention at this point that we do have a website that we've been running since March. It's still quite new, so there's not a great deal of stuff on there, but there is some stuff that might particularly be useful to you as DOSes or whatever the roles are you do within IH. That on there we do have some observation tasks which focus on demand high teaching, which you might well want to use yourself with teachers, particularly if you're going to observe, say, higher level experienced teachers, those teachers who have been observed into the ground and say, please don't come in and tell me to write the lesson plan on the board, or you know, don't tell me about my instructions. I've been told that 100 times. If you want to go in and give them a real challenging observation that will help them think, there are some observation tasks on demand. Is their teaching challenging their learners? There are also 2 ready-made seminars that you might want to have a look at, one of which we're going to do a bit of tomorrow, so we'll actually demonstrate how it works to you. So those are all on the website, and it's all free, it's all available. There's some articles there, and slowly over time we're going to put more stuff up there. So please feel free to go and have a look at that. I'll give you the address at the end here. The address of the blog. Thank you very much. We'll see more of this as the day goes on.